Well, hello, everybody. We have been reading through Fields of Home, and Steve and I wondered what happened to little Ralphie next, and he has not read the sequel, and I have not read the sequel, and it's kind of hard to get, but here it is. I have it. So we're going to read it. Let's find out what happens to Ralphie after he and his grandfather make up and plow some fields. Chapter 1, In a Bad Way. Nobody likes to go back to his hometown dead broke, but I'd made up my mind to do it anyway. That was in St. Joseph, Missouri on the night before the 4th of July in 1919, and that's why I was lying flat in a ditch in the freight yards a couple of blocks beyond the passenger depot. At the beginning of World War I, I'd been old enough for the draft, but the board in Medford, a suburb of Boston where we lived, had passed me by because I was the head of our family. Then when I tried to enlist, the doctor turned me down, so I went away to work as a carpenter at a munitions plant. By working 7 days a week, I made enough money to support our family and buy half a dozen $50 Liberty bonds. But during the summer and fall of 1918, I lost so much weight my clothes looked as if they were hung on a fence post. When the armistice was signed and I went home, Mother sent me right up to see our family doctor. Dr. Gagan was a gruff, blunt old Irishman and the best doctor anywhere around, but he wouldn't tell me what the trouble was until he'd put me in a hospital and had me examined by several specialists. Then he pulled up a chair beside the bed, sat down, and looked at me over the top of his steel-rimmed spectacles. "Son," he said, "you know me, and you know I don't shilly-shally around. You've got diabetes, and when a lad of under 20 years gets diabetes, he's in a bad way. These specialists think you can't make it for more than 6 months, but I don't hold with their notion. There's a few things that God's good sunshine and fresh air with a bit of common sense thrown in won't cure for a lad. Why don't you go back to Colorado where you were raised, or better still, to Arizona where 'tis warm weather all the winter long? Wear as little clothes as the law allows and let the sun shine at your body. There's no end to the wonder it works. Fetched up as you were in a saddle, you could likely enough make your way at some easy job on one of the big cattle ranches they have out there. Only the other day I was reading about one of them in the newspaper. I'll be dropping past the house to have a talk with your mother, and I'll write out a diet for you to follow. 'Twon't be tasty, but what's the odds if it does the trick? Now get your clothes on. 'Tis no good thing it'll be doing you to lie abed." My mouth went as dry as dust when Dr. Gagan told me what the specialist thought, but before he was through talking, I was all right again. Maybe it was because he said I should go back to Colorado. I'd been homesick to go back ever since we'd moved east, and the year after Father died. Then, too, Dr. Gagan thought I could make it, and I had more trust in him than in all the specialists in the world. He must have driven straight from the hospital to our house and had the talk he had with Mother. And the talk he had with Mother must have worked about the same way as the one he had with me. When I got home that afternoon, her eyes were red from crying, and she couldn't talk without choking up. But by the time the 3 youngest children came from school, they couldn't have guessed there was anything wrong. Then when Philip came in from his job, she seemed almost happy. "Ralph has decided to go back out west for a while," she told him. "Isn't that nice? You know, he has missed his cowboy friends ever since we moved here, and working on a ranch will do him a world of good. I'm sure that within a few months he'll have gained back all the pounds he's lost. He's going to Arizona for the winter, then back to Colorado when spring comes." I think that's all she ever said to the younger children about it, but Grace, my older sister, knew. She'd already gone to Boston for gluten flour and other things on the doctor's list before I got home from the hospital. That evening, Mother sent the others to bed early, and she and Grace and I stayed up till nearly midnight. While Grace darned my socks, mended my underwear, and packed my suitcase, Mother cooked things I'd have to take with me, and she hardly stopped talking for a single minute. I think most of it was to keep Grace and me from worrying, but some of it was to keep herself from being afraid. "Now you must not let yourself worry about us a particle," she told me as she mixed dough for gluten bread. "Dr. Gagan tells me that fear and worry are the very worst things for diabetes, and we shall be perfectly all right. Philip will finish his apprenticeship in the spring, and as a full-fledged cabinet maker he will earn us a good living. Gracie, would you bring that little notebook from the upper drawer of my dresser and the postcard Dr. Gagan left?" While Grace was gone, Mother slipped 2 loaves of gluten bread into the oven, put a dozen eggs on to boil, and told me, "Wherever you are, you must go to see a doctor every week and take him a sample, the first in the morning. Then have him mail a postcard about his findings to Dr. Gagan, and that way I shall feel as safe about you as if you were under his personal care. Gracie will write you out a whole stack of cards with all the questions on them, so the local doctor will have only to fill in a few check marks and figures." When Grace brought the notebook, Mother had her write down the recipe for making gluten bread and a list of things I could and couldn't eat. In between, she kept talking to me, trying to make the diet sound better than it really was. This recipe is a very simple one, and I'm sure you'll find that any housewife or ranch cook will be able to make you excellent bread by it. I suppose Dr. Gagan told you that you must eat nothing that is either sweet or starchy, but you may have any sort of leafy green vegetables, fish, chicken, milk, eggs, and tea or coffee without sugar. No red meat and nothing fried. But stewed or fricasseed or roasted chicken is very nice, and you remember what delicious trout you used to catch in the Platte River. Boiled trout are marvelous, and they're almost as good poached as fried. Then you can have almost any kind of nuts. That should help a lot, for nuts are very nourishing and easy for one to carry in his pocket. The last few minutes of going away from home are never easy, even if you know right where you're going and when you're coming back. I think it might be harder that time than ever before, but it wasn't, because nobody said goodbye. I was taking the morning train from Boston, so Mother woke me quietly just before daylight. She and Grace must have been up for an hour or so. Breakfast was on the table when I came downstairs, and my suitcase and a big basket of things I could eat were set by the front door. During breakfast, Mother kept talking about friends we used to have in Colorado and telling me things to say to them when I saw them, but she never mentioned diabetes. Grace didn't talk at all. I think she knew that Mother had to. And she didn't go to the door with me either. As I was leaving the kitchen, she just squeezed my arm real tight and only for a second, then turned back toward the stove. I thought Mother might break down when we reached the front door, and I was a little afraid I might too, but neither of us did. When I stepped out onto the front porch, she took the little notebook from the coat of her dress and slipped it into the breast pocket of my coat. It has always seemed to me that one is never alone when he has his Bible with him, she told me. So I put the little one your father had when he was a boy in your suitcase. I've jotted down in this little book a few of the verses that have brought me comfort when things seemed darkest. She started to say something else, then turned back quickly and closed the door. Mother had wanted me to cash my Liberty bonds before I started west, and to take the whole $300 with me, but I couldn't see much sense in that. It isn't safe to carry much money in your pockets when you're traveling around, and besides, I was sure I'd need only a few dollars more than my train fare to Arizona. Even if I did have diabetes, I wasn't sick, and though I wasn't quite as strong as I had been the year before, I was a long way from being puny. Then, too, I wouldn't be going west as a tenderfoot. By the time I was 10, I could handle a horse with a rope better than some of the cowhands I'd worked with, and the summer I was 12, I'd had a job at full cowhands' wages. I knew exactly what I'd do when I got to Tucson. I'd go down to the stockyards and help some of the cowhands who were bringing the cattle in. As soon as they saw how well I could handle a rope, some of them would get me a job with his boss. That's why I cashed only 2 bonds and took only $12 in my pocket. When I reached Tucson, things didn't work out the way I thought they would. The stockyards there weren't nearly as big as the ones they used to have in Denver, and there were only a few cattle in the pens, and only a few cowhands hanging around, every one of them out of a job. When I borrowed a throw rope from one of them and tried to hindfoot a steer, I found that I'd either gone rusty or forgotten how. The loop would close before the steer could step into it, or I'd toss it clear up against his hocks. The nearest I came to making a catch was when I snagged a cow by the tail, so I decided I'd better not try for a top hands job till I got back into practice. I'd just take any sort of ranch job I could get hold of, even mending fences, and I had a pretty good idea how to get hold of one. I knew that in every cow town there were employment offices that made a specialty of furnishing ranch help, but a fellow didn't have much chance of getting a job at one of them unless he could lay $5 on the line. With only $12 in my pocket, I didn't like the idea of spending $5 for a job, but it seemed to me that I'd better hunt up one of those offices and do it. That morning I'd finished the last scrap of the food Mother had packed for me. That is, all but the 5-pound sack of gluten flour she'd put in the bottom of the basket. And of course, I couldn't eat that till I'd found a job where there'd be a cook to make it into bread for me. Then, too, I hadn't brought a bedroll, so I couldn't sleep outdoors, but would have to rent a room. Between room rent and meals, a fellow can run through $5 pretty fast. I didn't have much trouble in finding an employment office, but when I stepped in, my mouth went dry for a couple of seconds, the way it did when Dr. Gagan told me the specialist didn't think I could make it for more than 6 months. There were at least 20 cowhands sitting around that office, and half a dozen more had real good rigs lying at their feet, saddle, bridle, bedroll, and a good fat war bag. Men like that might be drifters, but their top hands are awfully close to it, and they're not dead broke. By the time I stepped through the doorway and Between the time I stepped through the doorway and the time I reached the counter at the back of the room, I did some fast thinking. Every man in the place had working cowhand written all over him. They were as stout and tough as range bulls, and sun wrinkles were deep around their eyes, and their faces and hands were as leathery as tanned cowhide. I could barely scale 102 pounds with my shoes on, and was as pale as skimmed milk. Even though I was wearing a blue shirt, jeans, and the old Stetson I'd had ever since I was a kid, it would have been hard to find a tenderer looking tenderfoot. If jobs were scarce enough that men like these were sitting around an unemployment office, I was really in a bad way. Of course, I still had $200 worth of Liberty bonds at home, but Philip couldn't make a living for the family until he'd finished his apprenticeship in the spring, and Mother would need that money to keep from going into debt. Besides that, even if I did sell one of the bonds, it would take at least a week to get a letter home and the money back. Unless I got a job right away, I'd go broke. I was so busy thinking that I didn't notice the big man behind the counter till I was right in front of him and he said, "Hiya, stranger." It's funny how the sound of a man's voice and what he says can take you back 10 years or more in half a second. Hy Beckman, foreman on a ranch where I was water boy when I was 9 years old, had a voice exactly like that man's, and no matter how well Hy knew a man, he'd say, "Hiya, stranger," when they met. It's funny, too, how a long-forgotten sound like that will bring a picture back into your head. For a split second, I could almost think I was a kid again, sitting by Hy's elbow in the old bunkhouse on the YB ranch while he was playing stud poker. The cowhands on the YB ranch didn't play a very big game, and the bets were usually a nickel or a dime, sometimes a quarter. But Hy had been losing all evening and was down to 2 cartwheels and a couple of quarters. I watched as he turned up a corner of his hole card and peeked. It was the 4 of spades. Then he drew a 6 and stayed when Tommy Brogan bet a dime on a king up. On the next round, Hy drew another 4, but Tommy drew another king and bet another dime. There was already a 4 showing in the hand to Hy's right and a 6 in the hand to his left, but he sat for a full minute or more, seeming to study every one of the 7 hands. Then, without saying he was making a raise, he shoved a quarter into the pot. I knew there must be some pretty good hole cards because everybody stayed in to see the raise. On the last up card, Tommy got a queen, Hy a deuce, and Mr. Cooper, the boss, drew an ace to make him a pair. I was sure Hy would drop out, but he didn't. He stayed for Mr. Cooper's bet of a dime and for Tommy's raise to a quarter, even when I knew that Tommy would never buck the boss unless he had another king in the hole. I was afraid Hy might not have thought about that, so I reached a toe over and touched his boot, real easy. He moved it just enough to let me know he'd felt the touch. After Hy drew his down card and we'd peeked at it, I thought he'd gone out of his mind. It was the 9 of diamonds, leaving him only a pair of 4s, and beaten in sight by every hand on the table. Mr. Cooper must have known as well as I did that Tommy had 3 kings and his pair of aces topped, for he opened the betting with a nickel. But Hy was sitting between them, and slid both cartwheels into the pot without saying a word. Nobody else said a word either, but they all turned their hands down, and Hy pulled in the pot. From there on in, his luck changed, and he must have had $20 when Mr. Cooper said it was time to turn in. And here's a picture of all the men on the ranch playing cards. Yep. There they are. The last thing at night, Hy always walked around to see that everything was all right in the corrals, and I always went along with him if still awake. That night we were barely out of an earshot from the bunkhouse when I asked him, "Why did you pick a time to bluff when you had the very worst hand at the table?" "Ain't no time for bluffing like when you're beat in sight," he told me, "and there ain't no sense waiting till you're broke. How's a man going to run a bluff when he's broke?" I was certain that every cowhand in that employment office had me beat in sight, and I decided to tell the man behind the counter that I'd pay $5 for any kind of a job he had, regardless of the wages. But when Hy's words flashed through my head, I changed my mind in a hurry. I slapped my $10 bill up on the counter and said, "I'll shoot the whole 10 for a job if you've got a good one. I don't mind riding the rough string and can rope with the best of 'em once I get my hand back in." "Only got one job, and it's a pretty fair one," the man told me. Then he smiled and said, "Looking a bit puny. Been in the hospital?" "Yep," I said, "but I'm all right now." "Gas?" he asked. "No, I wasn't in the service," I said. "I was—" The man had been looking right into my eyes when he asked if I'd been gassed, but the moment I told him I hadn't been in the service, his eyes drifted away and he shook his head. "Not a chance," he told me, almost as if I'd asked him for a handout. "There's too many boys that's done their bit looking for jobs. You're in the wrong town." I didn't try to bluff at either of the other unemployment offices. I just walked up to the counters and told the agents I'd pay $5 for any kind of a job they could send me out on right away, and that I didn't care how small the wages were. Both agents were real pleasant when I first went in, and they both thought I was a soldier just back from the war, but when I told them I wasn't, they didn't treat me so well. The one in the last office I went to shouted long and loud enough for everyone in the place to hear him, "I ain't got no job for a slacker today, nor no other day. Get back where you come from." I hunted for another employment office until dark, then went back to the depot for my suitcase and started out to find a room and some supper. I found a little room near the stockyards that wasn't too bad and cost only 75 cents a night, but I didn't make out very well on supper. I went into half a dozen restaurants that looked as if they wouldn't be too high priced, but none of them had any leafy green vegetables or fish, and the only kind of chicken they had was fried. I finally had to settle for 3 boiled eggs and a cup of coffee, but they charged me 35 cents, even though I had neither bread nor potatoes. I didn't really feel homesick when I went back to my room. I'd worked away from home too much for that, but I did feel sort of all alone. When I couldn't go to sleep, I got out Mother's little notebook to look up a few Bible verses, but I didn't do it then. Before she had written down the chapter and verse numbers, she'd filled all the pages with things she'd wanted to say to me before I came away. At the end she wrote, "Son, you are in God's hands, so I shall not let myself worry, and I won't expect long letters. But do let us hear from you often, even though it is only a penny postcard." I never was much good at writing letters, but regardless of what Mother said, I knew she'd be worrying, so I got out the pad she'd put in my suitcase and sat down to write her a little note. Then once I got started, I couldn't seem to quit till I'd written a dozen pages. Ever since I was knee-high to a toad, the thing she had insisted on most was that I tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. But it didn't seem to be the right thing to do in that letter, so I just wrote whatever I thought would keep her from worrying. After I'd written about how much I liked my diet and how warm the weather was, I told her about having landed a fine job on a big cattle ranch right near town, where they had lots of leafy green vegetables and a cook who knew all about making gluten bread, and where I could get in to see the doctor every week. I told her that I'd have to spend my first couple of months' wages to buy a saddle and outfit and I wouldn't be able to send any money home till spring, but that I'd be getting my keep as part of my pay. In that way, I wouldn't need a penny for anything except the doctor, so she should cash the Liberty bonds right away, to hold the family over until Philip had finished his apprenticeship. In the rest of the letter, I just told her things I made up about how big the ranch was and how many cattle there were on it and how friendly everybody had been. When I'd finished, I almost believed it myself. It was a week before I wrote home again, and I had to do some more lying, but I found it a lot harder that time, and I couldn't make myself believe a word of it for a single second. I wrote that the place where I was working was the home ranch for one of the biggest cattle outfits in the Southwest, and that the owners had other ranches scattered around Arizona and New Mexico. Then after I told how much better I was feeling and how well I was getting along on my job, I said that the boss was sending another cowhand and me to one of the ranches near Phoenix, and that I didn't know exactly what my address would be, but that I'd write again when I got there. What had really happened was that I had gone broke. I'd talked to every cowhand and every cattleman who came into the stockyards that week. They'd all been friendly when I first talked to them, and I think a couple of the cattlemen might have given me a job, but they all froze up when I told them I hadn't been in the service. I went to every employment office in Tucson looking for a job of any kind. I only found one, and I'd have been better off if I hadn't found it. The agent charged me $3 for the job as night dishwasher in a little hole-in-the-wall restaurant, and then the boss fired me within an hour. I couldn't blame him for it because there were lots of returned Arizona soldiers, a good many of them Mexicans, who were looking for any kind of job. One just happened to come along at the wrong time for me. That job and the doctor and gluten bread were the reasons I went broke so fast. The morning after I wrote Mother my first letter, I had to pay 35 cents for 3 eggs and a cup of coffee. 3 eggs alone don't go very far, and neither does money if you have to buy them at 10 cents apiece. I decided that until I found a job, I'd better try to live on the gluten flour I'd brought from home, so I asked the cook in the restaurant what he'd charge me to make it up into bread. Even though I was furnishing my own flour, the best deal I could make with him was 50 cents, but that didn't seem too bad because I expected I'd get 5 or 6 loaves. Before I took the flour back to the restaurant, I wrote out Mother's recipe for making gluten bread, but the cook got huffy and wouldn't take it. He said he didn't need anybody to tell him how to make bread, and if I knew so much about it, I could make it myself. I'd have been 50 cents better off if I had. I don't think he'd ever seen gluten flour before, and I don't think he put anything in it but salt and water before he baked it, and he must have baked it all day. When I went back that evening, he made me pay him before he'd bring the bread out of the kitchen, and when he brought it, I knew why. He'd baked the whole 5 pounds of flour into 2 loaves that were the same size, shape, color, and hardness of paving bricks. If I'd been a dog with good teeth, I might have been able to gnaw a corner off one of them, but I couldn't make a dent in it with the teeth I had. After I tried for about 10 minutes, I threw both loaves in an alley and bought a can of salmon for my supper. For the rest of the week, I made out on a 10-cent pound of peanuts and a 15-cent can of salmon a day. I just about had to because of a mistake I made the first time I went to the doctor. And then, too, they were the only things on my diet that I could eat without cooking. In the first letter I'd written to Mother, I'd told her I was going to a doctor the next morning before I went out to my new job on the ranch. Even though I didn't have any job, I didn't dare not go to a doctor because I knew Dr. Gagan would tell Mother if he failed to get a report card every week. I put one of the cards Grace had written out for me in my pocket when I took the flower to the restaurant, then hunted up a doctor. He was a kindly old gentleman and treated me with nearly half an hour before he made his tests. Excuse me. He was a kindly old gentleman and visited with me nearly half an hour before he made his tests on the sample I'd brought. He wanted me to tell him when I first noticed that I was losing weight and what the specialists in the hospital said and what Dr. Gagan had said and what diet he'd laid out for me. He said after he'd looked at the diet pages in my notebook. Don't know but what I'd agree with your family physician instead of the specialists, but you'll find this diet rather hard to live on in this country, particularly if you're planning to do ranch work. Most of the grub will be bully beef and beans and biscuits or chili con carne and tortillas. On ranches that hire more than 1 or 2 hands, you won't find any green vegetables, and unless the foreman has a family of youngsters, he won't be milking a cow or keeping chickens. And of course, there is no fresh fish in this country. It seems to me you'll have to depend heavily on gluten bread, nuts, and canned salmon. You can make out all right if you have plenty of fresh milk, but without it you might run into trouble. However, you'll have to lay in a supply of gluten flour here, and I'd advise you to take plenty of it along. And any other town except Phoenix that have to send away for it. The doctor tested the sample I'd brought him in a while back in a little back room, and when he came out I noticed he'd made 3 or 4 check marks on my report card. Then as he weighed me and took my pulse, temperature, and blood pressure, he wrote down the figures. After he finished, he'd said, "Except for the sugar, it's not too bad. That will be $2. I'll mail the card to your physician when I go to lunch." If I'd known I wasn't going to find a job, I'd have told him I'd do my own mailing. But of course, I didn't know it then. That's why I had to save out $2 before I went stone broke and to go see him the second time. That time I told him not to bother about mailing the card. I'd take it with me and enclose it in a letter to Dr. Gagan. So he scrawled his name at the bottom of the card and gave it to me. I didn't write any letter and I didn't plan to, but I copied all the check marks and figures onto another card before I mailed the one the doctor gave me. I didn't bother about trying to copy the signature because no 2 doctors write the same anyway. After 2 nights in the hotel, I could see that I was living beyond my means, and that 75 cents a night would break me in a hurry. Besides, I wouldn't have any more use for my suitcase or the pinchback suit I'd worn on the train. A fellow would look pretty silly to be carrying a suitcase and no bedroll when he went to work on some ranch as a cowhand. He'd look even sillier with a pinchback suit and tan Oxfords instead of a denim jumper and riding boots. Before I started out to look for a job that 3rd morning, I took my suitcase, watch, and empty lunch basket and went hunting for a pawn shop where the owner would do a little trading. I had to try 3 or 4 pawn shops before I found one where I could make a decent deal. Of course, I expected to come out at the little end of the horn, but I didn't get stuck too badly. The suitcase wasn't new, and I'd had the shoes 6 months and the suit a year, but the lunch basket had double covers and was brand new, and the watch had cost $5. After an hour's haggling, I traded them for a pretty good blanket, a tarpaulin that looked as though it would still shed rain, a pair of boots that were just a bit scuffed and run down at the heels, a jumper and a pair of jeans that had been worn only enough to fade in good shape, and a throw rope that was almost new. I could have made the deal a lot quicker if I hadn't held out for the throw rope, but I needed some practice to get my hand and eye back in, and I couldn't do it without a rope. From the pawn shop, I went back to my room, folded everything I had inside the blanket, and wrapped it in the tarp. When I had corded it up, it looked like a good husky bedroll, so I took it down to the stockyards and tossed it into one corner of the scaler's office, just as if I were a cowhand in with a bunch of cattle for the shipping. During the day, I tried to get a job from every cattleman who came to the yards, and in my spare time, I practiced with the rope. It's hard to get in any good rope practice without a horse and some cattle to work on, but I'd have made the drover sore if I'd worked on any of the cattle in the pens. So I just sat astraddle of a fence to practice, trying to lay my loop around some pebble in an empty pen, or to make it stand close to the ground where some imaginary critter would step into it. That night and for the rest of the week, I slept by a feed stack just outside the pens, and I wasn't alone. There were 8 or 10 other fellows sleeping there, and every one of them broke in looking for a cowhand job. That's where I met Lonnie, and I don't know yet whether it was good or bad. And that is the end of chapter 1. Bye-bye, everybody.